Hi, and welcome to the 67th episode in our series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history. Today, we're going to finish what we started last week, which is Palestinian history. So we're going to do that part 2 now. The rules for those who are uninitiated. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. And there will be discussions about law as it applies to Palestinians. That is not legal advice. Despite the fact that I'm an attorney, this conversation is not attorney-client privileged. It does not create privilege, and it is not a clear interpretation of the law. You would need a lawyer to explain the bureaucratic gloss on those laws. I'm just talking about them in generalities. Now, this presentation, as Zach mentioned earlier, is a secular presentation. I'm going to try and address this from a non-biased point of view, although that will be incredibly difficult with such a subject, and that's why it's always my view that we should be respectful. But that being said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. And what I like to say is that these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning a 101, if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you already know some details, that's the 201. I'll take you to the next level, information that you might not know. I also have a 2-hour hard stop. So that means that if I don't get to every slide that I was intending to do, that's okay. At 2 hours at 9 p.m. Eastern time, you know that I'm not going to do any more slides. We'll go right to the Q&A, and any slides that are left, they'll be rolled over into next week. Now, if I put dates below a person, if they're a political figure, those are their years of service. If they're a non-political figure, they're a thought leader, philosopher, someone who didn't technically hold a role in government, then those will be the years of their life. And it should be pretty clear which is which, given the duration. And this, like the other 66 episodes in the series, will be available as a recording on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can watch this with those later in order to see the full length of the history. You can zoom into one region, you can, and of course, there's the other offerings that I'll discuss more in the Q&A period. If you want to see our meetings, not just for this Middle Eastern history series, but from our other series, please join our meetup. That way you can get updates as to when all of our events are happening, and you can attend those lectures and presentations and classes as well. And of course, we have premium Zoom, premium Meetup, and premium YouTube, all of which cost money. So we always appreciate donations. Please, if you feel like what we're doing is worthwhile, we greatly appreciate what you can provide us. We will continue to offer these for free because we believe in education and putting this material out there. But at the same time, it does cost money to keep the lights on. All right. So last time we discussed the idea of becoming a Palestinian. And the reason why it was so important for us to go through this is that we have the idea that there were people who were living in Palestine for generations and generations, but we have to distinguish that possibility of them living in a certain region with them having some kind of nationality that connects to that region. So the example I gave last time was Westchestrian, that somebody from the county of Westchester would be Westchestrian. But that doesn't actually have any political will behind it. They just happen to live in that county. So the development of the Palestinian identity took place over the 19th and 20th centuries through a number of political and social experiences, right? We also pointed out how the languages don't cleave neatly in terms of how to divide the Levant between the different dialects of Arabic. It's not as if one dialect identified as Palestinian and the other dialect identified as Lebanese. As you can see, there's a lot of overlap between the different dialects. And we move from being a Levantine identity that is relatively uniform to an identity that's based off of the Falah. The Falahin are the peasantry who lived in the area that we now call Israel and the Palestinian territories. And those people include Muslims, and they included Orthodox Christians, both of whom spoke Arabic, but didn't include Armenians, who are another group of Christians. It didn't include Druze, who are another group of Arabs. It didn't include Circassians, who are another group of Muslims. And of course, when the Zionist immigration began, it did not include the old Yishuv, or the Jews who were people with roots in the region for more than 200 years. Also, just to be clear, when I talk about indigenous populations and indigenous Jewish populations versus Zionist immigration, I'm not in any way denying or eclipsing the historic Jewish origin from the region, and that the majority of Jews are from the Levant. In fact, that is certainly the case. But when we're talking about in the last 200 years, it gives sort of a perspective on which population group is which population group. Now, there's a question here as to why are most of the dialects based on geography instead of something else like tribe? For exactly the same reason that dialects differ in other areas, like, for example, in Italy, before the unification of Italy in the 1860s. You have a number of cities that serve as focus points, and these points become the areas where different tribes would integrate and discuss, and therefore language tends to be regional as opposed to tribal, right? You also don't see before the 20th century a significant amount of mobility between these different regions. Now, of course, a significant portion, for example, of the Gazan residents today, both those who are indigenous Gazans, they were there before 1948, and those of whom who were refugees who either came in 48 or 67, those populations came from all over the Mandate of Palestine, the former Mandate of Palestine. And so those dialects are all mixed up now in Gaza. But this map is sort of how they originally spanned out. And of course, this map doesn't take into account changes that have occurred since the establishment of the State of Israel. There are a number of Hebrewisms that have integrated themselves into Palestinian dialects that are spoken in the West Bank, Palestinian dialects that are spoken in the State of Israel, because of the routine interaction between Israelis and Palestinians, in the same way that English words and phrases have become integrated into the language of Mexicans who live in the United States and Mexicans who live in Mexico to a lesser degree. And we talked about how citizenship is a fundamental problem in the Palestinian situation, because on two distinct occasions, the citizenship that a Palestinian held was revoked and reduced as invalid by the succeeding government. So the first time was in 1923 with the Treaty of Lausanne, signed by Ismet Pasha, who would become the second president of Turkey. He argued, as well as Reza Noor, who the two of them signed the Treaty of Lausanne with the British, among other parties. And the Treaty of Lausanne basically argued that the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic were not successor states to one another. The Turkish Republic, if we remember from last time I went over this, the Turkish Republic declared war on the Ottoman Empire, as well as against the Greeks, the French, and the Armenians. And so they saw Turkish citizenship as being something wholly distinct from Ottoman citizenship, and Turkish citizenship would only apply to those Ottoman citizens who were living within the territory of the Republic of Turkey. And since Palestine was outside of that, per the Treaty of Versailles, the San Remo Conference of 1920, all of these other declarations, it would be incumbent on the British to provide some form of Palestinian citizenship. And they did in 1925 with the mandatory passport. Now, the Palestinians who became disenfranchised of their citizenship at this point were those who were not habitually resident in the British Mandate of Palestine. That is to say, those Palestinians who immigrated to Western countries, primarily in Latin America, especially Chile, as we talked about, who routinely would come back to Palestine, but didn't habitually live there. And so they lost that access to the British mandatory passport that you can see in the center. Then you have the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And under the Israeli nationality law of 1952, the Israelis again said that they were not a successor state to the the Mandate of Palestine that the British had established. They declared war on the British in much the same way, right? Between 1946 and 1948, while the British were still in the Mandate for Palestine, Israeli militias like the Haganah and Israeli terrorist groups like the Irgun directly targeted British officials. and were fighting for independence from the British. So they saw themselves as being wholly distinct, and that they would not honor the citizenship of Palestine. Under the Israeli nationality law, which created the new Israeli citizens, they also had a residency requirement for non-Jews. For Jews, they were grafted in through the law of return, but for non-Jews, there was a residency requirement, and the 720 to 780,000 Palestinians who left or were expelled or fled, or whichever verb you wish to use, the nascent state of Israel could not meet that residency requirement, and so they did not become citizens. The roughly 150,000 who stayed within the borders of the state of Israel did become citizens, but they would then be holding an Israeli passport. So, sorry. Yeah. And then we talked about the concept of sort of statehood in Palestinian history. And we mentioned how in the Ottoman Empire, there was a significant amount of autonomy given to this region. And so you have a number of local leaders, notables, like Zahir al-Omar, who you can see there in the center. And he was able to foster a pluricentric state. This is in many ways what Palestinians idealize as a future Palestinian state, a state that is tolerant and in fact accepting of Jews and Christians, is able to make peace with the Bedouins, like the Banu Saqr, and is able to be economically self-sustaining, as Palestine was in the production of cotton at that time. And then, of course, we talked about in 1948 that there was the Declaration of Israel as a state, and this resulted in the Arab countries intervening in what up till that point had been a civil war. Now, just to put the chronology together, on the 29th of November in 1947, UNGA Resolution 181, the partition plan, was approved. And almost immediately after, there began a civil war within the Mandate of Palestine that went in three directions. There were the Jews on one side, the Palestinians, if we're using that term anachronistically, on the other side, and on the third side were the British. Now, the British were set to withdraw on the 14th of May of 1948, and they did so. And at that point, the Jews declared Israel as their state in accordance with the Resolution 181. So you had this transition from a civil war where the Palestinians were very poorly organized. They had two different militias. One of these militias was, in fact, a cover army for Syria, and the other of these militias was only a few thousand in terms of its numbers and was led by Haj Amin al-Husseini. But when the State of Israel was declared, 5 other Arab countries and 2 auxiliary armies from Yemen and Saudi Arabia invaded the territory. But they didn't do so on behalf of the Palestinians. They did so on their own behalf, especially if we look at the case of Jordan. In fact, the lack of cooperation between the Palestinians on one camp, the Jordanians in the second camp, and the Syrians and Egyptians in the fourth camp, and the Lebanese in the 5th camp, that failure for those different groups to coordinate and to have objectives that would meet each other resulted in a lack of communication between them altogether with regards to military strategy, allowing the nascent Israeli military to win a decisive victory in that war. So as a result, you end up with this situation where, as I said, 720 to 780,000 Palestinians are expelled, they flee, they're no longer within the territory of the nascent state of Israel. And you can see on the map on the right-hand side, the roughly 400 to 500 different Palestinian villages and townships that were destroyed. Now, these were destroyed through a combination of destruction during the war, some of it intentional by Israeli soldiers, some of it unintentional. Some of it was done after the war when those areas had become depopulated to prevent Palestinians from returning. Ben-Gurion made it an official policy that any Palestinian that was outside of the borders of the State of Israel when the respective armistices were signed would not be allowed back in the country. And if we go back to that nationality law of 1952, in order to be valid, you had to have an official registration in 1949, and people who had snuck back illegally, according to Israeli law, could not be officially registered in the land registry of 1949. And so therefore, those individuals would not get citizenship. So now we focus on, for a moment, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? This is a narrower category than the Arab Israelis. Arab Israelis is just a term that's used by the Israeli government and general population to refer to non-Jewish Israelis. But there are many non-Jews who are also not Palestinians. As I mentioned, the Druze, the Circassians, the Armenians, these are populations that Soviet Christians as well. These are populations that exist in Israel, not Jewish populations, but also not Palestinian populations. Despite this, Palestinian citizens of Israel make up over 90% of the Arab Israelis, and they were able to have citizenship, create political parties, and run in elections. Saifuddin Zu'bi was a Palestinian in the first government, the first Knesset, and he caucused with the Jewish party, the Labor Party, which was forming a coalition called Mapai, and that Mapai coalition ruled Israel pretty much without any electoral defeat until 1976. The majority of Palestinian citizens of Israel were very reticent about their situation, especially since they were living under martial law. Many Palestinian citizens of Israel lived in Palestinian majority cities. Nazareth is a good example of a Christian Palestinian majority city, and al-Fahm is a good example of a Muslim Palestinian majority city. And Tawfiq Ziyad was a poet who talked about the problems of the occupation as he saw it, the military occupation in his hometown, as well as the loss of Palestinians from their ancestral areas. And you can see more clearly how they are separated here in terms of where did people flee to and how did they flee. And we notice that Palestinians have a unique refugee status when we compare this refugee status to other refugees. And so I wanted to dig in a little bit about what that is and how that operates. The important thing to remember is that the United Nations Convention on Refugees was written in 1951. There were drafts of it in 1950 when the UNHCR was found, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And the fundamental premise of the UN Convention on Refugees is that a person should not be eternally a refugee. If it's the case that they can't live in a certain area of their home country, they will be provided funds to resettle in a different area of their home country, sort of like a witness protection program. If it's the case that they can't live in their country at all, that the policies that they're escaping are nationwide, then they will seek a recipient country to which that person can immigrate. The purpose of the UNHCR is to identify these kinds of people who have a well-founded fear of being persecuted, bring them to areas where they will not be persecuted, get them either citizenship or permanent residency or some sort of documentation that will guarantee them a place to come in that country. And once that is done, these people are no longer refugees. The refugee status is terminated. UNHCR's involvement in their life is terminated. And these people are subject to whatever the asylum system is in their new adopted country. Now, UNRWA, as I said, came 1 year before this, but its template doesn't look anything like UNHCR. And there's a few reasons for that, and a few reasons why that hasn't changed. The first one is that most of the signatories to the UN Convention on Refugees of 1951 are outside of the Arab world. Arab countries, as a general rule, are opposed to the integration of foreign refugees. And in particular, when it came to the Palestinians, they were against it for three distinct reasons. The first one is their general proclivity against it. They didn't want to integrate a foreign population into their domestic population. They considered it a possible source of instability. They considered it a possible source of non-cohesiveness in areas that were already relatively disparate. So The second thing is that the question of the Palestinians was one that Arab countries wanted the resolution of which to be their return to the former Mandate of Palestine in accordance with Resolution 194, right? UNGA Resolution 194 that was passed in December of 1948 basically said that any Palestinian wishing to return to his home and live in peace with his neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. Their view was that that date should be tomorrow. They should be permitted to return. Israel was, of course, at that point preventing their return. And Israel was arguing that these individuals would not want to live at peace with their neighbors, which I think is a fully reasonable counterpoint to this argument, despite the fact that it's generally the behavior that when populations are displaced by war, that they can return to their homes after the war has ceased. And of course, the third major reason that Arabs were opposed to granting Palestinians citizenship is that it would set a precedent that they could then, and that would then be applicable to other nationalities and other places. And they simply did not want to provide that. So you have this instability issue, you have this anti-Israel issue, and you have this precedential issue. So even after UNHCR came into existence, Arab countries have repeatedly pushed for UNHCR to not take over the mandate of UNRWA and have instead expanded the mandate of UNRWA to include educational institutions, healthcare institutions, and other aspects that are designed to take care of the refugees. And the refugee status that UNRWA oversees is transmissible along the male line. And the male line is important because, as we pointed out in last week, most Middle Eastern countries are jus sanguinis, meaning that you provide citizenship through the blood, through your parents. It's not based on where you're born, for example, like it is in the United States, which is jus soli. And additionally, in most Middle Eastern countries, only the men can pass, with the exception of extreme circumstances, only the men can pass citizenship to their children. So that's why it follows the male line. If a female Palestinian marries a male local citizen, be it of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, or otherwise, those children will take the nationality of their fathers, not their Palestinian mother. All right. So the next thing that we should address is how the occupations worked in the Palestinian territories. So if we look to the west, we look to Gaza. Gaza was in a particularly bad situation in terms of the fact that its population rose astronomically and created a massive density in the strip. To give a rough idea, Gaza Strip is more dense on average than New York City is on average. It is incredibly congested because of the quantity of people who went there in 1948. And the Egyptian military was in control of the position. The Egyptians did not want to create a Palestinian state at this point because they wanted to maintain that forward position against Israel. Gaza was a relatively effective military base. And at the same time, they realized that if they gave Palestine independence, true independence, then it could have aspirations separate from those of Egypt. And the Egyptian government didn't want another independent actor on the stage. And so they set up what they called the All-Palestine government. It was made of Haj Amin al-Husseini and a number of other leaders from various Palestinian factions that have been gathered in Gaza and would make rules in Gaza. They were given their own passports that theoretically represented their country, and numerous UNRWA refugee camps were established. Like you can see that Rafah refugee camp there. And it's worth pointing out that these refugee camps are not long sets of tents. They are cities in and of themselves because of how many people are there and how dense the population needs to be placed. In 1957, when Israel fought Egypt in the, 1956, when Israel fought Egypt in the Suez Crisis, this government was removed by Israel. It was replaced by the Egyptians in 1957, but it sort of winnowed away by 1959, and from 1959 till 1967, the Egyptian military directly controlled the region, abolishing the All-Palestine government and showing that it really had no power on its own. One of the things that we talked about is that Palestinians also moved in large numbers outside of the Middle East, and that had started in the late 1800s, but it continued especially after the Nakba, and Palestinians tried to rebuild their lives outside. Now, in the case of Jordan, we have a unique situation. The Jordanians believed that they were the inheritors to the whole Mandate of Palestine. That is the Mandate of Palestine as it was constructed in 1919, which was a mandate that included both the Mandate of Palestine that we're familiar with and the Mandate of Transjordan. In fact, the reason that the trans was dropped from the title of Jordan was specifically to permit, at least ideologically, the annexation of territories on the west bank of the Jordan River. That would be parts of what is today Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. So during the war against Israel in 1948, you can see King Abdullah I convened a conference in Jericho where he got the approval on the 1st of December 1948 to annex those areas under the provision of the Jordanian Arab Legion to Jordan. Now, it's also worth pointing out that while the West Bank is very small geographically when compared to the full extent of Jordanian territory, it is actually twice as populous as Jordan itself is east of the river. So this caused a massive increase in the Jordanian population, and the nationality law of 1954 effectively gave Palestinian residents in the West Bank Jordanian citizenship. There's a question here. I'm gonna address that later. One of the things that we see during the Jordanian control of the West Bank is that the Jordanians begin to support the growing resistance movements to the state of Israel within the territory of the West Bank. Egyptians are doing this on the Gaza side as well, and these groups are called Fida'i. Now, Fida'i come from a number of different political stripes. You have to remember that the Palestinians at this point have not coalesced either under an identity, that it wouldn't be until 1964 that the PLO was founded, for example. And there were Palestinian organizations that existed earlier than that, like the PFLP, which was more communist in orientation. We're going to see groups that are more Islamist in orientation. If you remember, Islamism is the philosophy of integrating Islamic religious practice with politics. It's Islamic theocracy. And so these Fedayeen would cross the border with the state of Israel and would try to kill civilians on the Israeli side. The Israeli police would respond. You can see this is a case where they killed 5 Fedayeen in 1956, and we're trying to figure out where they came from, what their motivation was. There were cases, of course, where Palestinian civilians got caught in the crossfire. Kfar Qasim is one is the most lethal example of that. This was in 1956. As I mentioned, all Palestinian citizens, all majority Palestinian cities in Israel were under military control from 1948 until 1964 or 66, depending on the city. And Kfar Qasim was one of these majority Palestinian cities in Israel. Those cities typically had a curfew, but there were some people who were out after curfew, and the Israeli police thought it was a Fida'i invasion, and they killed 49, 50 if you count the fact that a pregnant woman was killed, and so her unborn child was also killed. People who were killed by the Israeli policemen in a mistake of identity, functionally. And what you can see on the left-hand side is actually from Kfar Qasim. It's a memorial to the martyrs who died in the massacre in 1956. So we're going to discuss this a lot more tomorrow, and we have discussed this to a great degree in episode 62. But one of the fundamental sea changes that occurs during the 1960s is that Arabs get a new political ideology that swirls around the personality of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and this is Arab socialism. Now, Arab socialism is incredibly popular because Nasser finds an effective way to communicate with people. You can see, for example, Salt al-Arab, which is the name of or voice of the Arabs. This is his radio channel, and while television was not well distributed throughout the Arab world, radio absolutely was. So he was able to curate an Arab voice by using traditional Arabic mixed with modern dialects. He was able to communicate with effectively everyone across the Arab world and inspire within them this sense of rejection of a Western imposed system, as well as a rejection of a Soviet imposed system, which is why Egypt joined with Yugoslavia and India in creating the non-aligned movement in the 1950s. And it's worth sort of a discussion to point out what is Arab socialism, what does it believe, and how does it operate within a larger schema of the Middle East. So the first thing is that we have to remember that what Arab socialists were fighting against were West-aligned monarchs, right? We have different governments operating in Jordan, for example. That's the Hashemite monarchy that's closely tied into the West until 1958. You have the Hashemite monarchy in Iraq that's also tied to the West. You have the Syrian government under Shishakli, which tried to pursue better relations with the United States. However, Syria's vociferous anti-Zionist position was often a stumbling block in relations with the United States. You have the pro-Western Camille Chamoun in Lebanon. You have King Farouk until he's overthrown by Nasser in 1952. And you have a number of these Western-aligned monarchs. That was the traditional conservative approach. So anything to the left of that was left-wing. But we should be careful when we talk about the Arab socialists as left-wing, because they don't meet a lot of the criteria that we sort of think of that differentiate left-wing individuals versus right-wing individuals in philosophies. So if we look at the five divisions that I've sort of staked out here, the first two are certainly the case for Arab socialists. They believe in republics of secular power over religion and revolution towards new systems, better systems that are more integrative of people's needs. And they believed in a degree of wealth distribution. One of the key issues that plagues most of the Western-aligned monarchies in the Middle East today, and was certainly the case back then, is that an insane amount of wealth is concentrated in the upper classes, and the lower classes are practically destitute and compose significant percentages of the population. In many of these cases, the wealth inequality that exists in the United States, for example, is egalitarian in comparison. And so this redistribution was the socialist part of the Arab socialism. But if we look at the bottom three, we start seeing that the right-wing descriptions are more apt for what's going on here. In Arab socialist countries, you have a government that crushes protests and tries to enforce peace and stability through martial force. You also have a prioritization of an ethnic identity, that ethnic Arab identity, and other individuals who are not Arab are generally repressed and ostracized from the economic sphere and from the political sphere. And finally, Arab socialists are expansionist in their ideology. In fact, you could almost see the Arab socialists as a reverse imperialism, where they were trying to expand, especially from their base in Egypt, across the Arab world through acts of union. And as we're going to see when it comes to Egypt and Syria, acts of replacement and reorganization. So Arab socialists in many ways are not left as we would think of them. They happen to be left relative to what they were replacing, but that's a very different story. So now the Six-Day War happens, and all of the Palestinian territories come under Israeli control. You can see Palestinians who are citizens of Jordan over the Jordan River in this broken bridge. Now, the Israelis bombed the bridges intentionally because the Jordan River has a very steep elevation. And so it's impossible to drive tanks over the Jordan River without a bridge or some other device to hold them. This effectively meant that Israel, once it had routed Jordan from the territory, was able to take control. So what we end up seeing in this post-occupation environment is that Israel decides to invoke what are called the Deadlands laws. And these Deadlands are a number of regions that had existed under the Ottoman period. If somebody is not using a piece of land, if they don't own a land, it's not being put to any use, it has to revert to the state. And so Israel used that to effectively permit its own population to settle within the West Bank. And I think this is basically where we left off last time. So after the Six-Day War, we had a situation where Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were all humiliated by Israel. And Egypt at this time was continuing to harass the Israeli position on the east bank of the Suez Canal, because Israel had expanded their borders all the way to the Suez Canal through what was called the War of Attrition. But that war was, generally speaking, not a serious success for Egypt and even required Soviet direct intervention. On the Jordanian side, you had the Fida'i continuing to operate and trying to execute operations within Israel. As I mentioned, in 1964, the PLO was founded, and so many of these were led by the charismatic young Arab socialist leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, and he was based in the town of Karama, just across the border from Israel on the east bank of the Jordan. The Israelis believed they could cross the Jordan River in a quick operation, find Yasser Arafat in the town of Karama, arrest him, and bring him back to Israel. The operation was anything but easy. Israel lost a significant amount of personnel and hardware. Yasser Arafat was not able to be found, and while the two villages were successfully attacked and raided, the difficulty that the Israelis had in overpowering the Jordanian military effectively became a symbol of pride for the Jordanians, and it became one of the things that made King Hussein appear more and more legitimate to Jordanians. After he surveyed the battle scene, he declared, "We are all Fedayeen," basically saying that Jordan was embracing the Palestinian struggle against the state of Israel. And it's worth pointing out why that needed to be said. In 1951, when King Abdullah I, Hussein's grandfather, was assassinated, he was assassinated specifically because many Palestinians suspected, rightly, and it was later proven correct, that King Abdullah I had underground contacts with the Israelis, and those contacts were very close to creating a peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. And the Palestinians did not want a peace treaty between the Jordanians and Israel, no matter how much the Jordanian monarchy may have wanted it, because that would prevent them from returning to their homes, which they considered to be the result of to be theirs under both moral right and the UNGI Resolution 194 that I showed earlier. But not 2 years later, the situation with the Palestinian militants in Jordan began to become more and more unsustainable. What ended up happening is that you had Palestinian militants, especially in Amman, riding around in their cars, almost like gang members who controlled significant parts of the city. They operated in different parts of the country as well. And the Jordanian monarchy was very much afraid that the kind of revolution that had overthrown Iraq in 1958 and turned it into a republic, Egypt in 1952 and turned it into a republic, in North Yemen, at Egypt's prodding in 1962, all of these different monarchies that were collapsing into republics, King Hussein was certainly afraid that this is what was happening in Jordan. And so he wanted to act against this large-scale surge of Arab socialists against himself as a Western-aligned monarch. So in order to determine whether or not he could actually deal with the issue, King Hussein had to realize that he had borders with two enemy states. The first enemy state was Israel, of course, and they had gone to war as recently as 1968, right, with the Battle of Karame. And so he had to maintain a large number of forces along the border with Israel, including their occupied West Bank. On the other side, he had to maintain a lot of soldiers on the border with Syria. Syria was in a strongly anti-American position at this point in time, and was being consolidated by strongman Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current Bashar al-Assad. And his ideology was strongly in opposition to Western influence and increasingly in favor of reorienting Syria's position within the Arab world, which meant that he might very well support operations against the King of Jordan. And so he had to defend those borders there. But if Jordan patrolled the borders with Syria and with Israel, he would simply have no people left to deal with this effective insurgency, this country within a country that the Palestinian militants had created by setting up their large-scale gangs. You can see, for example, the picture here is of the PFLP, but the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine was only one of these militant groups. Of course, the biggest one was Fatah, which was the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a community of different organizations, Fatah being simply the largest, and that was led again by Yasser Arafat, who becomes increasingly the leader of the Palestinian resistance movement. Reaching out through his American contacts, King Hussein requests to know whether Israel will take advantage of any opportunity if Hussein tries to take care of his own house, if he tries to clean out the Palestinian militants. And in the same moment, Hussein also knows that Israel has a tendency, and we're going to see this tendency throughout our subsequent lectures, to respond when it's directly attacked by launching counterattacks into the territory of the Arab state whence those attacks came. And so King Hussein asks Israel if they will preemptively agree to stand down. And the most interesting thing that he asks Israel is if neighboring countries, primarily Syria, in his view, come to support the Palestinians and try to overthrow him, would Israel support removing those enemies of Jordan? And Israel gave a lukewarmly positive answer on all of those questions. And that gave King Hussein the impetus in September of 1970 to begin rounding up his military and launch an attack on Amman. It was an extremely bloody affair. In fact, King Hussein, before he died in 1999, was asked what was the most difficult decision you ever made. And he said that the decision to take back his own capital city, this invasion of 1970, was the most difficult decision he had ever made. There are different estimates as to how many Palestinians died in the retaking of Amman. Some estimates have, the Jordanian estimates have it around a few hundred. It's much more likely to be several thousand. And Palestinians estimate the entirety of Black September, which was 8 months of war, to be between 15,000 and 20,000 casualties, including civilian deaths. Now, once Hussein was able to take Amman back, he proceeded to move to the north and to the west, which is where the greatest concentrations of Palestinians were, very close to that point where Israel and Syria meet. Those are the areas with the largest pockets of Palestinian resistance, and Palestinians fought back until August of until the middle of 1971. You can see, for example, this is the defense at Ajlon, which is an area very close to the border with the State of Israel. And after this point, the PLO was forcibly ejected, of course, from Jordan, and the situation in Jordan became relatively more stable. So once the Jordanians had expelled the Palestinians, you began to have a situation where the Palestinians wanted to strike back even more extensively, get more of world opinion to notice them. Because one of the things that they had noticed is that during Black September, only the Syrians attempted to help them, and the Assyrians attempted to help them with false flag Palestinian tanks. So the Syrians took their own tanks, they painted Palestinian decals, they called it the Palestinian Liberation Army, which instead of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Palestinian Liberation Army, and these were effectively stopped by the Jordanians with logistical assistance from the Israelis. But by and large, the Palestinian cause was unknown on the global stage, and so they wanted to increase the awareness of this. The other thing is that a number of members had become radicalized over the course of the Black September War with Jordan. And so Yasser Arafat had a very difficult question of what to do with these more radical members. And so these two different issues sort of fused together on what the Palestinians determined to be their solution here, which was to create an organization that would be a subgroup of Fatah that would operate outside of the Middle East. And they named it after the war that they had just lost, Black September. Now, senior individuals within Black September, like Abu Dawood, who was responsible for the Munich massacre, coordinating it and organizing it, have pointed out that Black September was the same as Fatah. They shared the same reporting lines. They had a similar connectivity and a similar purpose, and were simply separated for the ease of management. That said, Black September was viewed by many Westerners as operating entirely independently. In many cases, the acts of violence that they perpetrated were in direct result of the losses that they felt in Black September. Abu Ali Ayad, who you can see on the left-hand side, was one of the Palestinian militant generals who was killed in Black September. And so one of the Black September organization's first assassinations was 4 months later to kill Wasfi Attal. Wasfi Attal being the Jordanian prime minister who was responsible for directing the attack on Ajlon, where Abu Ali Ayad was killed. But as I pointed out, this was something that operated outside of the Middle East. And what ended up being developed were autonomous cells in numerous different countries that had no direct ties to each other, no direct connection to what the other ones were doing, and they all had code names to prevent any secrets from falling into the hands of enemies should they be captured. I can see that there's a hand raised. If you have a question, you can save it for the Q&A, or you can write it in the chat and I will respond. Now, the next major strike of the Black September organization was in Munich, where they attacked the Olympics that was ongoing, and they kidnapped and then later murdered 12 Israeli athletes. It's been called the Munich Massacre. And what ended up happening there was that Palestinians from the Black September organization went to the area where these individuals were sleeping, corralled them, and the Germans tried to send a military force in order to save the hostages. They were unsuccessful, and so it's been a stain on the Olympics ever since. There was also an attack in Manhattan by the Black September organization, perpetrated by Khalid al-Jawari on the 4th of March in 1973. The attack was unsuccessful because the bomb did not go off properly, and it would have been an attack on Times Square. Now, starting with the increasing international attention that was being drawn to Black September, following about 1974, 1975, Yasser Arafat began to try and distance himself from the organization, try and shut it down, because attacking Westerners in their own countries was increasingly not just getting the notice of Westerners, but negative notice. And the Westerners were becoming increasingly unsympathetic to Palestinian aims. The last major operation of Black September was a hijacking operation where they hijacked a number of they got onto a plane in Athens and hijacked a plane destined for Paris that had a number of Israeli citizens and Jews on board. The Israeli military flew an operation they called Operation Entebbe to find those individuals and bring them back to Israel or to whatever countries that they belonged. Now, we then move to 1979, and Israel manages to make a key strategic boon out of this year when Egypt makes peace with it. And this did a number of important things with regards to the Palestinian situation. The first one is that Egypt's signing of the Camp David Accords effectively broke the Arab League. Egypt had been the leader of the Arab League for decades, and making peace with Israel was seen by the other Arab leaders as so thoroughly unacceptable that Egypt was thrown out, which meant that the Arab League had no effective leader, the Arab world had no effective leader, and so the Palestinians got lost in the shuffle to a greater degree than they already had. The next thing is that Israel wanted to oppose the PLO and a number of these secular aligned organizations that would coordinate with the PLO. And to that end, Israel began to support a counter group, a group that would try to divert attention away from the PLO and divide Palestinian resources. And the group that they settled on was the Muslim Brotherhood chapter that was operating in the Palestinian territories that we know today by its own acronym, Hamas. So Israel began to provide security and funding for the organization clandestinely. That's what resulted in the creation of the Islamic University of Gaza in 1979. There are numerous cases that we know of where Israel returned weapons caches seized from Hamas operatives to those Hamas operatives so they could continue to increase in power and therefore thwart the PLO. It was a form of divide and conquer. So after the PLO were kicked out of Jordan in 1971 as a result of Black September, the war, many of them went to Lebanon. And so it's worth understanding a little bit about Lebanon's political structure to understand why the Palestinians coming to Lebanon was so deleterious. So Lebanon is split between a number of Christian groups and a number of Muslim groups, and for the purposes of Lebanon, Druze are identified as Muslim, despite Druze generally not identifying that way themselves. So Lebanon is a very precarious balance of Christians led by the Maronites on one hand, and the Sunni and Shiite Muslim populations together. The fundamental issue is that Mount Lebanon itself, in the center of the country, is almost exclusively Maronite, over 80% Maronite. But those areas are not very agriculturally viable. And so the Maronites wanted to expand into what they called Greater Lebanon, which would include significant valley populations of Muslims. And in fact, once you created Greater Lebanon, the population of Christians and Muslims becomes roughly 50-50 like that. Sorry, becomes roughly 50-50 like this. But the Christians wanted to establish themselves as the leaders of the country, and so they created a parliament that would favor them 6-5, so that there would be more Christians, and then Lebanon would be effectively Christian run. It's worth pointing out as well that the Maronites, especially, but other Christian populations as well, wanted to have further and deeper relations with Western countries, whereas the Muslim population wanted to have further and deeper relations with Syria. This created a natural rift in the country, as well as questions about its direction. There's another piece about Lebanon that's worth really understanding, which is that people often think that ethnic groups will fight side by side or one by one. And so you'd expect all the Maronites to be on the same side, all the Druze to be on the same side, and that's simply not the case. What you end up having are various coalitions of different governments. Various coalitions of different parties that are unified based on their interests. So, for example, if you look at this Battle of Ain Dara, which I'm just using as an example, the Qaisi faction is made up of a number of Druze, such as those in the Jumblat clan, and the Yemeni faction is also made of Druze, like the Alameddin clan. You have a number of Ottoman governors, for example, of Sidon and Damascus, who are Sunni, and in the Qaisi faction, the Shihab dynasty at this point in time was a Sunni dynasty. Now it's a Maronite dynasty. They've many of them have converted. So it's not that people of one religion are on one side. It's that these are different individual ethnic groups and clans that, because of how they're fighting, who they're fighting with, will often be rotating and changing. And we're going to deal with a lot of that complexity when we get to the Lebanese Civil War in about a month. So we now have these Palestinians moving into Lebanon from Jordan. And so we should talk a little bit about what the situation was for Palestinians in Lebanon to start with. There were a number of Palestinians who had fled to Lebanon in the 1948 war. And so they became refugees in Lebanon by virtue of that war. Now, the legal situation for Palestinians in Lebanon was particularly dire relative to other cases, because if we remember, that exact precise balance of Christians and Muslims had to be preserved in order to justify that 6-5 Christian to Muslim ratio in the parliament. And the Palestinians were overwhelmingly Muslim, and their numbers were sufficient to make a dent in those percentages. So the Palestinians were considered a foreign population in Lebanon. Even those who were born in Lebanon were considered a foreign population. And further to this, they were kept in their refugee camps. In many cases, they were not allowed to have real property. So that meant that they were forced to live in the camps by virtue of the fact that they couldn't buy anything to live on. And rental agreements were difficult for them to sign on to as well. Now, as foreigners under the Labor Code of 1962 in Lebanon, they were allowed to work in any profession aside from a certain group of professions, and I'm going to get to that in a second, that their country, as a foreigner, was reciprocally allowing Lebanese citizens in that country to work, which, of course, for Palestinians basically meant that they couldn't get jobs because the Palestinian government didn't exist and therefore couldn't give Lebanese immigrants to Palestine any jobs that they could do. So what you ended up with was a situation where Lebanese Palestinians, and by Lebanese Palestinians, I mean Palestinians who are living in Lebanon, who do not get Lebanese citizenship, but are effectively living their entire lives in Lebanon. These Lebanese Palestinians cannot get good jobs, especially because that group of jobs that I mentioned at the beginning that were sort of cut off, those are the top 60 most profitable jobs. Those are only allowed to be performed by Lebanese citizens. This has kept the Palestinian population in Lebanon in and around poverty. About 50% of the Lebanese Palestinian population is at or below the poverty line. So the situation to most Lebanese Palestinians looked like a massive glass ceiling because they could see the Lebanese around them, including other Sunni Muslims, Sunnis who were Lebanese Sunnis, being able to benefit from all the economic and growth that Lebanon was undergoing in the 1960s. There was a massive American investment. There were a lot of European tourists. This is the time that Beirut was known as the Paris of the East. And the Palestinians were not being able to benefit from any of this. And so you begin to see Palestinians increasingly agitating for a change in the situation in Lebanon. The first to do so was George Habash. He was Orthodox Christian, and he led the Arab National Movement, which was a movement that worked with Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, and to a certain degree the Druze population in order to advocate for a shift in the Lebanese government. Now, if we remember, in 1958, Camille Chamoun, who was a Western-aligned Maronite president of Lebanon, was kept in power by the United States, and that allowed him to focus on having a West-leaning orientation. So you effectively have a monarch. He can't really be replaced. In 1958, the U.S. military arranged for another Maronite to take the power from him, who was more or less aligned with him. That's Fouad Shahab. But this was effectively a monarchy in the sense of it didn't represent the will of the people. It represented the will of a certain clique. And it was Western aligned. And so the natural inclination that Palestinians felt, because they were already part of the Arab socialist movement, and a number of Muslims a number of Muslims also felt was that Lebanon should move into a more Nasserist style. They should begin to assert more and more independence. And to this effect, when compounded by increasing numbers of Palestinians coming in from Jordan, both as a result of Black September and in advance of Black September, the militants in especially the southernmost region of Lebanon became more and more active. In addition to this, because of the Arab world's antagonism towards Israel, and the PLO was able to gain funding through a ritual cycle of violence. So the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Arab National Movement coordinated together to go across the Lebanese-Israeli border, which at that time did not have as effective of a fence as you can see here. The Lebanese are on the left side of the fence, the Israelis are on the right side of the fence. They would go across the border, attack Israelis, and then come back. And these repeated punitive raids resulted in increasing funding from the Arab countries who saw this as a way that perhaps the Palestinians could get their homeland back. And this was a positive thing in their view. And so the PLO got more and more funding than actually the Lebanese military itself did, allowing what had effectively happened in Jordan to happen in the south of Lebanon, which is that the Palestinians created their own state within a state and were controlling through the use of their own militants what was happening in the south of Lebanon. In order to create a more effective understanding between the Lebanese military and these Palestinian militants, Emil Boustany of the Lebanese military went to Cairo in 1969 and signed with Yasser Arafat the Cairo Accord. And the Cairo Accord effectively gave the Palestinians their own territory in the south of Lebanon. It's smaller than you can see on the right-hand map, because that's based on what it was in 1981. But if you look at the southernmost part of that, excluding the cities of Tyre and Sidon, that area was under the control of effective Palestinian militias with significant foreign funding. So we should then begin to move into the escalations of the Lebanese civil war. So we start to move into the early 1970s. And as we get to around 1975, we start to see both sides begin to fight each other. The Palestinian militants take front and center stage as one of the major militias on the Muslim side in the early days of the war. And Pierre Gemayel and Camille Chamoun take sides as the leaders in the Maronite side of the war. Now, what ends up happening is that the Palestinian militants ethnically cleanse West Beirut of any Christians, and Pierre Gemayel and Camille Chamoun ethnically cleanse East Beirut of any Muslims. And so you have these two parts of what had previously been a largely integrated city being divided into what became known as divided by what became known as the Green Line. And it was called the Green Line because the lack of people living there had resulted in plants beginning to create a line sort of between the different houses. And because it was green, it was called the Green Line. We had ethnic cleansings occur on both sides. One of the most famous ethnic cleansings perpetrated by the Maronites against Muslims in East Beirut was the Battle of Kantira, or the Massacre of Kantira. And the Palestinians immediately reciprocated with the Massacre of Damour in the western side of Beirut. There were a number of other massacres as well, such as the Siege of Tal Za'atar, when a Maronite force attacked what was effectively a Palestinian majority city and reduced it, as you can see in the pictures, to significant amounts of rubble. So, into this situation, we have an increasingly powerful Palestinian Liberation Organization, an organization even more powerful than the Kataib, which is the Maronite militia led by Pierre Gemayel. And the Syrians had a long-standing relationship with the Maronite government that had previously existed. And so in 1976, the Syrians invaded on the side of the Maronites in order to ensure their stability and therefore ensure the return of commerce. The way that they decided to intervene was with this Palestinian Liberation Army. Now, don't let the Palestinian flag and emblem fool you. This is a Syrian army made up of Syrians who will dress in Palestinian cosplay, for want of a better term, and pretend to be a Palestinian force. Eventually, the Syrians will invade under their own colors, but this Palestinian Liberation Army, as opposed to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, directly confronted Palestinian militants from both the PLO and the PFLP and their various offshoots. And so going into 1976, the Syrians are on the side of the Maronites, and the Palestinians are being beat back, and they're beginning to have less and less control of the country. But by the end of 1976, the Syrians decide that it makes much more sense for them to be ideologically aligned with the Muslims, the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Palestinians, and to a certain degree, the Druze. And they see this because those groups are more Arab nationalist in orientation, more pro-Syrian by default. And so the Syrians begin to press their advantage against the Maronites. At the same time, the Syrians begin to try and influence the political aspirations of Palestinians in Lebanon, the Lebanese Palestinians. And so they send a Syrian Palestinian. These are Palestinians who live in Syria, of course, not Syrian citizens, but they were born and raised in Syria. These Syrian Palestinians were from a division of the Ba'ath Party called Asa'ika. And Asa'ika was sent to Lebanon to try and create a Lebanese Palestinian Ba'athist group. Asa'ika was one of the largest Palestinian militias that operated in the Lebanese civil war context. And that group began to stir up incredible amounts of success for the Palestinians, especially in the southern part of the country, against the Maronites. Now, in order to prevent increasing border crossings, the Israelis decided to support a different Maronite group, not Pierre Gemayel's Kataib, but Sami Haddad's South Lebanon Army. And so in 1978, the IDF meets with the South Lebanon Army in order to coordinate their defensive position along the Israeli border and therefore create a good neighbor that could ostensibly work with Israel in curtailing the threat from Palestinian militants, especially those from Fatah or As-Sa'iqa. Trying to go around this, a number of Palestinians lead a direct attack in Israel, led by Dalal Mughrabi. She takes a boat and arrives on the coast near Tel Aviv, and she ends up shooting her way through a number of different beachgoers and takes a bus hostage. The bus is eventually destroyed, but the moral of the story is that she was able to break through this Israeli protection on the southern border. Now, Dalal Mughrabi was probably the last assailant coming from a country outside of Israel's control to penetrate that deeply into the state. And she has been hailed as a martyr for many Palestinians because of her actions against the state of Israel. Now, this, however, does not draw Israel into the war beyond a few small operations in coordination with the South Lebanon Army. They let the South Lebanese deal with the majority of the threat at this point. What changes the calculus is that Black September, or an offshoot thereof, Abu Nidal, which was a Palestinian militant group funded by the Iraqis, decided to try to assassinate the Israeli ambassador in London. That's Shlomo Argov. He had been serving as ambassador from 1979 to 1982. And so Abu Nidal coordinated this attack. He was shot and he was in a coma for a while, but he did survive. He lived until about 2003 or so. And we know that the Iraqis were supporting him because as soon as they shot him, the Palestinian militants fled to the Iraqi embassy to deposit their weapons. Now, the attempted assassination of an ambassador was enough for the Israelis to argue that they should enter the war, and so you see an Israeli direct invasion. Now, at this time, Ariel Sharon, the future prime minister of the state of Israel, was defense minister, and so he coordinated the war with a number of the Maronite militias. While the South Lebanon army was certainly still strongly in Israel's orbit and a supporter of the Israeli government, Sharon knew that the South Lebanon army wasn't large enough to directly challenge the Syrian military, and certainly wasn't large enough to challenge the Syrian military, and probably not even large enough to challenge the PLO directly, beyond its small area along the border. You can see that area along the border as the Israeli security zone. That was roughly the area that Sami Haddad's South Lebanon army patrolled. So in order to be able to effectively intervene in Lebanon and to remove the PLO as a threat, Ariel Sharon reached out to Bashir Gemayel, the son of Pierre, and make an alliance with the Cata'im. Now, Sharon wanted to maintain alliances with a number of different Lebanese groups, but Bashir Gemayel wanted to consolidate power for himself, and that created a rather tense relationship between those two individuals as Ariel Sharon tried to put together an anti-Palestinian coalition, an anti-Syrian coalition, and Bashir Gemayel wanted to get more funding and more direction on his own. In particular, we have actions by the Cata'ib that were increasingly violent against the civilian population. And we've already talked about the massacres of Kantira and Tel Azata, which were perpetrated by the Maronites against Palestinian and other Muslim populations. But the most famous one, of course, are the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, which are two different Palestinian refugee camps that are in close proximity. The Israelis were advancing with their military further north towards Beirut. And as they did so, they came under their control came these two refugee camps. The Israelis patrolled the exterior to prevent anybody from coming in from the outside, and the Cata'ib, or phalangists led by Bashir Gemayel, although I don't think he was there that day, but his forces entered the camp and slaughtered the Palestinian civilian population, arguing that they were there trying to remove any militants. Due to Israel's involvement, the war became increasingly desperate for the Palestinians, and you ended up with a ceasefire being signed between the Israelis and the Syrians over Lebanon. Part of that ceasefire in 1983 was that the PLO would be ejected from Lebanon and that the PLO couldn't survive there anymore. So numerous Palestinians who had first fled from Jordan now fled from Lebanon, and they went to Tunisia. And this had the impact. They only went to Tunisia, by the way, because no other country would take them. And while Tunisia had generally had lukewarm non-relations with Israel, after the arrival of the PLO, those relations quickly soured. In particular, you had a number of different situations where the Israelis tried to attack positions within Syria to remove the PLO as a possibility. The first one is that the PLO continued to demonstrate that they were fully capable of attacking Israel, even at a distance. In particular, you have the capture of the Aspirations, which was an Israeli ship that Palestinians boarded at sea. And so I think I have the date wrong there. I think it should be 1985. Sorry. The Israelis were eventually able to get the ship back, but it showed that the PLO had reach. And in order to coordinate an attack at such a distance from Israel, in order to deal with the PLO being in Tunisia, they needed high-level intelligence from the United States, and the United States was not willing to give it. So, accordingly, they instructed one of their agents within the United States, that's Jonathan Pollard, in order to transmit that information so that way they could coordinate the attack, which was called Operation Wooden Leg in 1985. And while this was the most devastating attack on the PLO, it was not the only attack on the PLO. Israel also targeted Abu Jihad, or Khalil al-Wazir, who was a member of one of the various Palestinian splinter organizations, while he was living in Tunisia. And with his death, the Palestinian movement begins to try to re-envision a way of continuing the struggle, because clearly militant activity from a foreign destination is not going to be effective in fighting the state of Israel. And so they were going to try and choose a diplomatic route to try and secure their independence and their state. There's a question of what organization was Pollard part of. I believe somebody would have to check this. I believe he was part of just intelligence networks more broadly. I don't think he was a member of Mossad or any specific named agency in Israel. In fact, most spies are not directly employed by agencies. They're handled. So, in order to move in this direction of sort of more diplomatic resistance, in 1988, in the city of Algiers, in Algeria, Yasser Arafat convened the Palestinian Congress, and at the end of it, he declares the the State of Palestine to be independent, using UNGA Resolution 181, that same resolution that created a Jewish state and an Arab state in 1947, to legitimize the creation of a Palestinian state. And roughly coterminous, alongside this declaration, you begin to see the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank beginning to revolt themselves. Now, between 1967 and 1987, this territory was under the control of the Israelis, increasingly subject to the creation of their settlements. And the Palestinians would routinely cross the border, primarily as guest workers within the state of Israel. And there was low-level violence, but generally speaking, the situation was peaceful from the Palestinian side. It might have been slightly belligerent from the Israeli side. That fundamentally changed in 1987 when Palestinians began to use suicide bombing. This is the first time we really see this form of attack. We have seen it on one or two occasions prior to the first Intifada, but generally speaking, the attacks were like Mughrabis, where it would be an armed fighter trying to kill as many people as possible, or a Fidai trying to kill as many people as possible. They would die, most likely, but that was not the goal. The Intifada results in the deaths of roughly 5,000 to 6,000 Palestinians, probably about 2/3 that number of Israelis, and it effectively results in Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister, pushing for a peaceful solution, and the Oslo Accords are signed on the 13th of September 1993, which put in physical form the Declaration of Independence that Yasser Arafat had issued in 1988, namely that there would be some kind of Palestinian state. Now, of course, that Palestinian state was one that was heavily circumscribed by Israel. Under the Oslo Accords, major cities were given to the Palestinian Authority, as the PLO's governing arm came to be called. But the Palestinian Authority only had mixed control with the Israeli military over the connection points between major cities, and areas where there were no cities were still held primarily by Israel. If we look at this map, you can see all the areas in dark brown. Those are Area C. Those are areas that under the Oslo Accords were held exclusively by Israel. The areas sort of that are light tan are those that are civilly administered by the Palestinian Authority, and the cities within them are also exclusive of Israeli military power. So the next issue really becomes that Jordan follows up the declaration, the Oslo Accords in 1993 with their own peace agreement in 1994. And that peace agreement effectively meant that Jordan was foregoing the territories in the West Bank. Now, internally within Jordan's domestic law, they had already severed the West Bank from their territory in 1988. But it's sort of worth talking about the legal implications here for a second. So if we go back in 1949, Jordan annexes the West Bank and includes it within the internal territory of Jordan. This move isn't recognized internationally, but what we need to follow here is Jordanian law. So under Jordanian law, these were areas of Jordan, and the people in them are Jordanian citizens. Okay. Now, in 1967, Israel comes to occupy the territory. From the Jordanian perspective, this is Jordanian territory under Israeli occupation, not Palestinian territory, Jordanian territory. And Jordan lives with this fiction until 1988, when they decide, despite the territory not changing, they're going to withdraw their claim to it and give it to the nascent Palestinian nation, the one that had just declared independence in Algeria. So now you have this situation where you have Jordanian citizens who are either A, from the West Bank, but now living in Jordan proper, B, Palestinian citizens of Jordan who are still in the West Bank, and C, Palestinians who are not citizens of Jordan because they came to Jordan at some point after 1954, after the nationality law was passed. So, for example, these are Palestinians from Gaza and are therefore living in Jordan, but since Jordan is no longer taking claim of Palestinian citizens, they're not Jordanian citizens either. So this legal situation resulted in what was called the card system. So the yellow cards were the most advantageous, and those were belonging to Palestinians who habitually resided east of the Jordan River. These would remain Jordanian citizens, with no distinction between them legally speaking, and ethnic Jordanians, for want of a better term. Now, the yellow card itself is only given to the Palestinian citizens of Jordan because that would allow them to move through Israeli checkpoints and get into the West Bank, which would allow them to reunite with family in those territories. So that's why they had that yellow card. Then you have the green card, and the green card was for individuals in the West Bank who would be losing their Jordanian citizenship. The Jordanian passports that they were given stopped being interminable passports, but were ones with an expiration date. And those green cards would permit them to cross the Jordan River and see family on the east bank of the Jordan, regardless of whether Israel had issued them a visa or not. And the blue cards were the worst. The blue card individuals could not cross into Jordan. They could not get access to employment or medical or other benefits that Jordanian citizens are privy to. And as you can see in that big Arab post, it says "Mamnu min as-safar," forbidden from travel. Those individuals could not cross between the West Bank and the East Bank of the Jordan River. But as would become immediately apparent, such a system would need coordination with Israel. So it shouldn't be surprising, because we've already talked about how Jordan has under-the-table communications with Israel as early as 1951, and probably even earlier. We know that King Abdullah I coordinated with Golda Meir before Israel's independence war in 1948. But in 1983, the Jordanians created this color-coded transit system, foreseeing an end to the West Bank being under their control. And in 1987, Margaret Thatcher tried to create a peace agreement between the Jordanians and the Israelis, represented by King Hussein and Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, that would have given the West Bank back to Jordan. But after that failed, Jordan went the full route of severance. In many ways, this was decried by the international community because the Palestinian nationality, as we pointed out last time that we met, is not a real thing. Palestinian passports are not representations of Palestinian nationality. They're only laissez-passer. They're only documents that permit a person to move between different countries. And so by revoking their Jordanian citizenship to people on the West Bank of the Jordan, effectively Jordan was turning these people stateless. And it wasn't just the Jordanians and their legal approach that was somewhat negative towards the Palestinians. Throughout the Arabian Peninsula, there's an increasing frostiness to the way that they have been dealt with in other countries. Probably the most famous of these was Kuwait. There were, at the height, over 400,000 Palestinians in Kuwait. Most of them are Jordanian Palestinians. That is to say, they have Jordanian citizenship, but they're ethnically Palestinian. But a number of them were not. Regardless, they were in Kuwait as guest workers. And we should understand that these are guest workers with no possibility of acquiring Kuwaiti citizenship or permanent residency, despite the fact that they may spend 30 years, perhaps in their entire lives, in the country of Kuwait. And in Kuwait, they were allowed to work in a number of different ministries, primarily education and healthcare, but also as day laborers, as nearly any other position in the Kuwaiti economy. And to put into perspective, Kuwait only has a population of around 2 million. So 400,000 Palestinians is actually quite a noticeable amount of people. That's about 1 in 5 people living in Kuwait. But now Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinians, as we've seen so far, was very appreciative of Saddam Hussein, because Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq since 1979, was very supportive of the PLO and provided them significant amounts of funding. And so you can see there Saddam Hussein and Yasser Arafat holding hands. Yasser Arafat returned the favor when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990 to try and annex it into his Republic of Iraq. This resulted in a mass exodus of Palestinians from Kuwait. Half of them left during the Iraqi occupation. The rest left immediately afterward. And they left because of the instability during the Iraqi period. And when the Kuwaitis took back control following Operation Desert Storm and the American intervention, which we call the Persian Gulf War, the Kuwaitis were under the impression that the Palestinians were a fifth column that had sided with the Iraqis. The Kuwaitis did not provide evidence for this assertion. They didn't need to. They felt it very, very strongly. And that for them was sufficient reason to deny the renewal of the permits for all those guest workers, to expropriate in many cases their assets and territory, and to tell them that they should return to Jordan or to whatever country that they came from. Another source of antipathy towards the Palestinians that has increasingly arisen in the Gulf region comes from both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And this is less per se antipathy towards the Palestinians and their cause, but much closer to say an understanding that an alliance with Israel is critical for their containment of Iran, which they see as a much bigger threat, and one that is existential to them, as opposed to the Palestinians, which would be somewhat of an offshoot. Yusuf al-Taiba, for example, he is the Emirati ambassador to the United States, and was strongly behind facilitating what became known as the Abraham Accords, and we'll talk about what those are in a second. His view was that Israel is a key economic and trading partner, as well as a good military partner in the Iranian containment, and therefore he pushed for a normalization of relations with Israel. Bandar bin Sultan bin Abdulaziz was a Saudi prince from the reigning dynasty who had very good relations with the Americans. In fact, sometimes he was called Bandar Bush because of how often he spent time with both George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr., the American presidents. He argued on Saudi national television, which is heavily censored, so you should understand that his remarks in many ways reflect the unofficial position of the Saudi government, that while the Palestinian position may be moral, it is unsuccessful. And while the Israeli position may be immoral, it is successful. And therefore, we need an alliance with Israel against Iran. To go back to Kuwait for just 1 second, the Kuwaitis had been asked by the Americans and other third parties why they expelled the Palestinians. And Saud Nasser Saud Sabah, a diplomat from the ruling As-Sabah clan, basically argued that he didn't need to make a defense. His view was that the Palestinians in Kuwait were a fifth column, and their presence in Kuwait was destabilizing. Especially given what we've seen with Lebanon, given what we've seen with Jordan, Western rulers were very quick to not make any issue of Kuwait looking after its own stability, because the failure of these states to have stability, at least from the American perspective, was the possibility of a decaying Middle East, and especially the Persian Gulf region, where America was heavily oil dependent at the time. The next movement that we see within the Palestinian world is that the Second Intifada breaks out. Now, this is a group of terrorist attacks precipitated, at least nominally, by Ariel Sharon visiting the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this creates a round of suicide bombings until 2005. And it's roughly resulting in the same number of casualties on both sides as the first Intifada, a little bit higher over the course of that time period. And the main reason that it stops is that Israel constructs a barrier between the West Bank and Israel proper. Some call it the separation wall or the apartheid wall. Some call it the separation fence. This barrier effectively prevented suicide bombers from crossing into the territory of the State of Israel. It's worth pointing out that the PLO, and by extension the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority is the governing arm of the PLO, had a program where they would reward financially the family of any Palestinian suicide bomber, which helped facilitate the recruitment of many poor Palestinians, poor from a financial perspective, Palestinians to perform acts of terror in the knowledge that their families would be taken care of. Now, one of the important points that we should remember is that both Gaza and the West Bank had Israeli settlements after 1967. But in 2005, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon ordered the evacuation of the Jewish settlements in Gaza. And you can see those on the map. Those are those areas in blue of the Gaza Strip. And while there were Israeli citizens who pushed against the Israeli forced withdrawal, eventually all those populations were either resettled to the West Bank or to Israel proper. And that should give us some context for the Palestinian Civil War, which broke out in 2007. So in 2006, the Palestinian Authority had one of its first open elections. And in that election, it was effectively a contest between two political parties, Fatah, the leading Palestinian Liberation Organization member party, which was increasingly despised by Palestinians for its close relationship with Israel. Remember that Israel controls most of Area C in the West Bank. So in order to collect taxes, in order to police, in order to do anything, the Palestinian Authority had to coordinate with Israel. And in addition to that, it was very nepotistic and corrupt. And contrary to that was the Hamas party led by Ismail Haniyeh. And Hamas was this Islamist party that had never held power and argued that it would be less corrupt and more violent towards Israel in recouping Palestinian rights. Which of those arguments was more compelling is unclear, but what is clear is that Hamas won the majority of seats in the Palestinian election of 2006. This resulted in Mahmoud Abbas, the successor to Arafat, who had recently passed away, trying to governing situation with Ismail Haniyeh in the early part of 2007. But that broke down rather quickly as Fatah was reticent to really share power. And so between the 10th and 15th of June in 2007, Ismail Haniyeh directed the militants of Hamas to run over the Gaza Strip. It's worth pointing out that the Gaza Strip, after the Israelis withdrew their settlements, was one unified piece of territory. And so the militants in Gaza were able to effectively commandeer the entire territory. By contrast, the West Bank looks like a piece of Swiss cheese if you're looking at the holes and not the cheese. And so a military movement through all the regions of the West Bank that are Palestinian controlled was effectively impossible without Israel's signing on. And Israel was certainly not going to sign on to the creation of a Hamas-run state. So what ended up happening with this Battle of Gaza that was finished on the 15th of June 2007 was that Hamas was in control of Gaza and the Palestinian Authority was in control of the West Bank, a situation that has remained until today. Starting from this point, Mahmoud Abbas selected Salam Fayyad as his prime minister in a special emergency government that would expel all the Hamas members. And Salam Fayyad ruled until he left in 2013 under pressure from Palestinians who were angry about his corruption. Now, I want to talk a second about Salam Fayyad because it's worth sort of making a counterpoint about the different kinds of Palestinian leadership that we've seen. Salam Fayyad was primarily a Western-aligned liberalizing economist, and he had strong ties with a number of Westerners and promoted investment within the Palestinian territories. In particular, he's well known for stressing the economic viability of Palestine before the necessary political independence of Palestine, which was something that Westerners generally liked to hear and was less positively seen by the Palestinians themselves. Salam Fayyad also managed to take cuts of a lot of the industry that he brought to Palestine. So In many ways, it was no good deed goes unrewarded. Another member of Mahmoud Abbas's government that I'd like to shine a light on is Saeb Erekat. And Saeb Erekat is an individual who he recently passed in 2020, but he was part of Palestine's negotiating team pretty much since the beginning and has been involved in nearly every agreement that has been signed between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. In his view, the actions of Hamas in stirring up Israel would be deleterious to the survival of the Palestinian people. And in fact, that is what we see. Now, there's a question as to why does Palestinians' governance model include extremists? The simplest way to say it is that those are the political parties. There's no reason why any country doesn't have extremists running as political parties other than that they wouldn't get votes. And we've seen Western countries, especially around the time of World War II, most of them had fascist or communist parties. So the fact that these parties are extreme is not surprising, especially since the demands are extreme too. Now, one of the things that I pointed out when we talked about Islamism and jihadism as political movements, right? This is the installation of Islamic theocracy through violence, is jihadism. We entered this new situation in 2007 where Hamas was actually a government. So we go from this period where Hamas is a militant organization almost exclusively to a position where Hamas is awarding doctors and building out schools and all of these other infrastructure developments, police, society, welfare. And Hamas is effectively creating a governing apparatus within the Gaza Strip in order to organize its population. And that, of course, engenders loyalty from the population because they're being taken care of in a certain extent. Now, the presence of Hamas as a governing entity on Israel's border was something that Israel couldn't stand, and neither could Egypt. Israel and Egypt actually negotiated quite strongly on containing Gaza after Hamas came to power. And so a number of the border crossings were closed or sufficiently curtailed, and Gaza effectively became isolated from much of the rest of the world. Hamas lived up to its claim that it would begin violence against the state of Israel and began to construct tunnels in order to promote the Palestinian resistance against the state of Israel. This resulted in numerous retaliatory and preemptory strikes by the Israelis against both Hamas leadership and, in larger extent, against the Strip itself. Some of those battles include Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, Operation Protective Edge, and a number of border clashes that have persisted to this day. Some of these come from infiltrations through these types of tunnels. Some of them are the result of Palestinians trying to just cross the border as civilians and hoping that the Israelis won't fire on them. Some of them are rocket attacks that try to target nearby Israeli towns. Regardless of the method, Hamas has fomented attacks against the state of Israel. And in fact, that has become part of their claim to legitimacy, having supported the Palestinian cause. You can see, for example, that poster where it says, Kul am wa jilad jadid. Kul am wa antum bakhair is a common Arab greeting for New Year's. And so they changed it to Kul am wa gilad, being the name of an Israeli soldier that they had abducted in 2006 and who was finally released in 2020 or 2021, and a new Gilad. So I guess it would be like everybody's fine in the new year and we have a new Gilad. So that was Hamas advertising to its own population. You also see that Hamas, in terms of its governing apparatus, is incredibly restrictive. This is very typical of other jihadist regimes as well, but freedom of speech was strongly curtailed. In fact, there were protests at numerous points because trying to get Hamas to stop fighting Israel and come to a ceasefire. And Hamas would actually shoot the protesters who were protesting in Gaza against the ruling of the Palestinian Authority. There have also been, ever since Hamas came to power, increasing attacks on the less than 1% of Christians who live in the Gaza Strip. It's almost overwhelmingly Sunni. And the government is increasingly propped up by Qatari and Iranian funding. We also have to focus our attention a little bit on the situation in Syria. So after 2011, before 2011, the situation of Syrian Palestinians was actually very similar to that of Lebanese Palestinians, better on the question of work. Syrian Palestinians were able to get jobs much more easily than Lebanese Palestinians could. But the key differentiator between Syrians and Syrian Palestinians is that A, Syrian Palestinians could never become Syrians. There was no way for them to acquire Syrian citizenship. And B, they were also not ever allowed to own land, just like or to rent their own territories. So that's exactly the same as the Lebanese Palestinians. When the Syrian civil war broke out, you had a situation where the Palestinians tried to keep their head down. There was no group, as far as I can tell, that was supportive of the Palestinians. That said, the Syrian government under Assad was under the impression that the Palestinians would support the rebels, given that the rebels could propose them to have greater rights, especially since those rebels were majority Sunni, as were the Syrian Palestinians, but the government by Assad was run by Alawites. So what ended up happening is that the Free Syrian Army was able to take control of a number of areas where refugee camps were or close to them, especially the Yarmouk refugee camp, which was one of the largest refugee camps for Palestinians in Syria. And it was put under their control. When Assad liberated it, he also massively attacked it, believing that the population would be loyal to the Free Syrian Army. To date, there's no evidence to show that they colluded or supported them. Regardless, as you can see, significant parts of their buildings were destroyed, significant percentages of their population have died, and in fact, more Palestinians have died in the Syrian civil war than have died in all of the wars against Israel since Hamas took control of Gaza. Now, UNRWA, of course, has the duty to look after these Palestinians because, as I mentioned, they have an expanded mandate relative to what they would otherwise have if these were typical refugees. And we're only able to get to them in 2014, and it was a touch-and-go basis even after that point. There were a number of other Palestinians that were tortured by Assad. This is a picture from 2003 that was smuggled out of a torture facility inside of Syria. And you can see the Palestine tattooed on his arm, and a discussion of the brutalization on his arm that he suffered. Now, Syrian Palestinians in many cases fled over the border to Lebanon or to Jordan. And Syrian Palestinians are in a different legal category from Jordanian Palestinians, even if they are now in Jordan, and they're different as a legal category from Lebanese Palestinians, even if they're now in Lebanon. So you can see, for example, this is Cyber City. This is the refugee camp that is specifically allocated for Syrian Palestinians in Jordan. They're not allowed to join, for example, the large Zatari. There's a famous refugee camp in Jordan called Zatari, which is for Syrian refugees. They're not allowed to join those camps, and they're not allowed to join the UNRWA camps that are designed for Palestinians from Palestine or Jordanian Palestinians. We also have another reason why Assad was very much opposed to the Palestinians and afraid that the Palestinians would turn against him. Khalid Mashal, who was the leader of Hamas based in Syria, helping to get Syrian funding for Hamas in Gaza, was in favor of the Arab Spring in 2011, and so the Syrians believe that many of the Palestinians, similar to how the Kuwaitis believe that many Palestinians would be a fifth column, they believed that the Palestinians would be a fifth column in Syria. And so Khaled Mashal fled to Qatar, where he was very warmly taken in. And of course, the Palestinians in Syria could not join him. Many of them, in fact, many Syrian Palestinians actually joined the other Syrian refugees trying to make it to Europe, because at least in Europe, they'd be on even footing with other non-Palestinian refugees. So, as I mentioned, the biggest issue that the Palestinians have at current with the wider Arab world is the Abraham Accords. So, in 2020, a number of Arab leaders signed with the United States and Israel normalization treaties that started with the Emirates and Bahrain, with, of course, Saudi approval. And the Moroccans joined in December of 2020, and the Sudanese are in the process of joining as of this discussion. Now, the primary issue that the Palestinians have is that the Abraham Accords effectively sideline the Palestinians and their claims and issues in the furtherance of Israeli integration in the region. Because one of the fundamental arguments that have been made by most of the Arab states prior is that they would not recognize Israel until there was a Palestinian state of some kind that was fully independent. And that was completely ignored by this, by these declarations and agreements. And we actually are right on time. So questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. And while I'm waiting for those to stream in, okay, that's what happens when when PowerPoint swaps your images for a second. So this is the Middle Eastern History Series. I present the series every Wednesday. We also discuss Asian philosophy with Jason Peng on Saturdays. We also have our European Union security episodes, which are roughly every month. There are Powerful Women and Dead Languages episodes that should be coming up very soon. And of course, we have our shorter run series, like our Ukraine series and our Islam 101 series. And we should resume the Ukraine series probably sometime in May, especially when troop movements start to begin in earnest. And of course, we even have older series that you can see on our YouTube page. And of course, the link for that is below. So I have two questions. The first one, are the Hezbollah members of parliament in Lebanon elected? Yes, they are. After, and of course, we're going to discuss this much more in depth when we talk about Lebanon. The situation in Lebanon after 1991, with the Taif Agreement, was that the Lebanese parliament would be apportioned 5-5, 1-1, meaning that the Muslims and in all their assorted minorities put together, and the Christians and all their assorted minorities put together would each have 1-1 parity in representation. And one of the parties that runs on the Shiite tickets is Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah is also very popular in areas with Greek Orthodox populations and a number of other non-Muslim populations because of the welfare infrastructure that Hezbollah has created. Right? They build schools, they have police officers, they have healthcare facilities. They aren't just a militant organization. They certainly have that, and they certainly perform acts of terrorism, but they do run a political party. Now, the wrinkle here is that Hamas has a more effective military and militia apparatus than does the Lebanese national government. And so there have been points where, when the election doesn't go Hezbollah's way, that Hezbollah has put Beirut under siege. So what ends up happening is cabinet reshuffling to give Hezbollah disproportionate power than it otherwise would have had. So that sort of sits at the answer there, which is a very sort of crossroad of the situation. there's also a question about if Hezbollah collects fees for passing certain roads. Absolutely. You have to realize that in the West, we're used to powerful states. These are situations where the national government has control over all the territories. And if you try to create anything in opposition to the national government, you will be crushed. The national government has a significant power of police, significant militaries. They can remove any insurrection. Lebanon is the exact opposite situation. It's a national government that is incredibly weak, and local and regional governments that are very strong and usually ideologically aligned. And so they can extort their populations very effectively. And that's something that Hamas does. Now, of course, they argue that the money that they're charging on these toll roads goes to providing all the services that they provide, like the medical services and the education and the policing and the everything else. So, and of course, the struggle against the eternal Zionist enemy, just, another line item in the list. So that's sort of where all of that sits. Now, there's a question of if China is building infrastructure or expanding the 5G network in the Palestinian territories. I'm not aware of China investing in the Palestinian territories. Doesn't mean it's not happening. It's just not something I'm familiar with. China recognizes Israel, generally speaking, and tries to stay outside of the Israeli-Palestinian debate. It's generally been Chinese policy not to have a policy on other countries' domestic affairs, and they consider the Palestinian issue an Israeli domestic affair. I know that the Japanese have been heavily involved in building industrial parks and other sorts of facilities, especially outside of Jericho. But I don't know of any Chinese construction in the West Bank. There was one other person that raised their hand. If anybody wants to speak now and ask a question directly, they can raise their hand and I'll call on you. All right, Rebecca, I'm trying to unmute you. There you go.
Hi. Thank you for this presentation. It's really great. I'm glad I found this group. Really early on, you mentioned something about how when, like, after the war, like many Palestinians were displaced in Israel by the Israeli by the Israelis taking over. And then you said that they weren't able to return as is normally the norm after war. And, for me, I guess just because maybe we tell the stories of more tragic people, I just can only easily think of people who are not able to go home after being displaced. And as someone who's grown up around people who are more Zionist leaning, I feel like I always hear a narrative about how generous the Israeli government has been to the lands that they conquered, and no one else has been so nice. And I'm just wondering if you can give me an example or two that I can go to, because I can't easily think of it.
Sure. Because there's a lot to that question there, but I'm gonna go back to the slide. Oh, sorry if I remuted you. Okay. So if you look at this map on the right-hand side, you can see all of those orange dots. Those orange dots represent Palestinian towns or villages. We're talking about populations of less than 4,000, let's say, right? I know the actual number is a little higher, but most of these are very small. And these towns don't exist anymore. The Israeli government removed them. Now, in particular, you have different types of treatment that the Israelis visited upon the Palestinians. And I talked about this more in last week's presentation, but more than happy to reprise it a little bit here. So you have on the, let's say, positive side, one of these settlements is Abu Ghosh. Abu Ghosh is a Palestinian village that existed relatively close to Jerusalem. It still exists today. And it was a village that sat on a very strategic position along the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway, which is one of the major focal points of the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 to 1949. Now, the Israelis wanted to use that position to monitor the highway. And the Palestinians of Abu Ghosh decided that they would rather throw in their lot with the Israelis than try to wait for the Jordanians to relieve them. And so the Sheikh gave his 5 sons to Israelis as proof that, like, they could hold them in custody, and therefore if he decided to betray the Israelis, his sons would die. They survived, everybody survived the war. Abu Ghosh became part of the state of Israel. The Palestinians who live there are Palestinian citizens of Israel and remain so to this day. So that's on the most positive side. On the most negative side, if you talk about the Israeli marches in the northern part of Israel, the area close to the Lebanese border, that was an area, and still is an area that is disproportionately Arab. In fact, I think it's 75 or 80% Arab still today by Israeli censuses. This is the area that's sort of between Haifa and Lake Tiberias, but halfway away from both of those. So sort of that central column. In there, you had Operation Hiram, or Operation Hiram, if you're using the Hebrew, where a significant amount of territory was taken extremely quickly, and the Palestinians in those areas were rounded up and forced out. It was so repugnant that Ben Gurion actually scolded the commanders on the Israeli side who perpetrated this. Didn't allow the Palestinians to return, though, but Palestinians were forcibly expelled from a number of towns in the north. And you can see those all along the border with Lebanon. So those individuals were not treated generously. They ended up as part of the Lebanese Palestinian population. Some of them tried to sneak back in. Mahmoud Darwish, for example, is a very famous Palestinian poet. He and his family fled in 1949 across the Lebanese border. Specifically, I don't know if it was specifically Operation Hiram, but it was part of the war in the north. He slipped back into Israel illegally. He was not counted on the Israeli census, but he was allowed to get Israeli residency because he couldn't qualify for citizenship, but he did qualify for residency. But eventually he was expelled from Israel because of his alliance with the PLO. He met with Yasser Arafat. He became a PLO member. There's a lot of complexity involved, but he was expelled effectively from Israel because of that. But that's an example of somebody who crossed the border after the war illegally. Now, there's a lot of intermediate examples. There's stories where Palestinians heard that a neighboring village was attacked, and so they fled too, fearing the Israelis were going to come for them. There are questions about whether they heard newscasts from other Arab countries saying that, let us deal with the Zionists, and after the Zionists are removed, we'll allow you to come back, right? So there's all these different sort of things floating in the air. Once you get that 720,000 Arabs who aren't in the state of Israel anymore, the ones who remain are treated relatively charitably. And by relatively, I mean they are, as I said, they're given Israeli citizenship. They're permitted to have the same access to rights and privileges of Israeli citizens. There are a few important caveats, though. The first one is the one that I mentioned, which is that the Palestinian majority towns and cities were under Israeli military occupation until the 1960s. The second one is that Palestinians cannot buy land if that land is owned by a Jewish organization, whereas Jews can buy land if that land is owned by a Jewish organization. Probably the most famous of these is Kuf Kuf Nun, or the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. Those territories comprise about 13% of the state of Israel. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that private property isn't really a thing in Israel. property is owned by the state, and it's given to people on what's called a 99-year lease. So the 99-year lease is effectively the same as owning property from a human functional perspective, but it does mean that the Israeli government chooses who is allowed to take land and sell land. They are a third party necessarily to any real estate transaction between two individuals. And so Arabs, generally speaking, have been prevented from buying land in areas that the Israeli government deems sensitive. And Arab majority cities, despite the fact that they have demographics that would make them grow more quickly on average than most Jewish cities, are constrained from growing. So these are the differences. That said, and I think Ismail Khalidi, who's a Bedouin Israeli, sort of puts it best, Israel treats its minorities, even its minorities who are thoroughly opposed to its governing structure, right? Because a significant percentage of Palestinian Israelis are anti-Zionist. Whether they would want Israel to simply become a democratic state and therefore a state that would be majority Palestinian is a different question, but it treats them better than nearly any other country in the Middle East treats its minorities. It's not even a close contest. The only cases I can think of where minorities are treated positively are cases where they're associated with the ruling clique: Circassians in Jordan, Alawites in Syria, Sunnis in Iraq under the under Saddam Hussein's republic. These are the few exceptions. Otherwise, minorities, or better said, those disempowered in the Middle East, are routinely abused to a far greater degree than the way that Israel treats its Palestinian citizens. If we talk about the West Bank and Gaza, it's a different conversation. Rebecca, does that help?
So actually, I think I probably didn't explain myself well, which isn't that surprising. What I was trying to ask, and maybe I misunderstood what you said, it was my impression that you said that it seems obvious to me that if you're a conquered people, of course you're going to be getting the raw end of the stick, irrespective of like how bad it is. Like I don't really know why you need to have like contests to figure out how deserving someone is when they already have a bad deal. But I had the impression that you said that generally speaking, after the war, other nations have behaved better than Israel. And because I often hear people say this, I was trying to look for a specific example, because when I think of people who conquer others, I only think of displaced people and how bad it is. So I'm just wondering if you know more than me, because it's just a helpful, concrete example to have of what a different, better version of conquering, as weird as that is, looks like. Like, I don't know.
No, a good example would be Bosnia-Herzegovina. You had a number of cases where people fled Republika Srpska forces or fled the forces of the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. I don't know how familiar you are with the Bosnian conflict, but basically the Bosnian conflict pitted Orthodox Christian Serbs against Muslim Bosniaks and Catholic Croats. So the Catholic Croats and the Muslim Bosniaks were more or less in an alliance. They fought each other in the city of Mostar, but generally speaking, they were in an alliance. So necessarily there were people who were uprooted. More people were uprooted by the Serbs than were uprooted by the Federation. But regardless, people were uprooted on both sides. After the Dayton Accords of 1995, people could freely settle wherever they wanted to within the country of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, of course, people are generally not going to settle in the territory administered by the opposite party. It's just not safe, but they had the option. Another example, I'm trying to, if we look at almost any of the wars in the New World, for example, Colombia against the FARC, the wars of the Triple Alliance in South America, which was very old war, but basically after these wars are concluded, people are allowed to return to their homes, even if their homes are now in territory controlled by an opposing force. In the case of Colombia and the FARC, it's territory controlled by the Colombian government, even though these people have been living in FARC territory for decades now. And in the case of the War of the Triple Alliance, it was Paraguayan territory that's now part of Argentina or Brazil. Yeah, I'm trying to think. So those are general examples. A lot of Israelis and pro-Zionists will categorize what happened in the 1948-1949 war as a population swap, because it works a lot more naturally to say this 720,000 of Palestinians who fled for whatever reason is matched by the 850,000 Mizrahi Jews who fled for whatever reason from the Arab countries. And so you have those two ethnicities basically being swapped in the same way that you had swaps following the the Turkish War of Independence in 1923, the same way that you had population swaps in Pakistan and India in 1947. And this was generally, you had population swaps in the Treaty of Neuilly-sur-Seine between Bulgaria and Greece. You had all these different population swaps, and so that way, this sort of fits into that larger picture. The fundamental difference is that the Palestinians don't recognize it as a population swap, whereas in all those other examples, both sides recognize it as a population swap. I'm trying to think of other cases, but generally speaking, at the closure of hostilities, people are allowed to return to their homes. It's not yeah. All right. So I have one other question here. Do you see the Palestinian territories becoming completely eradicated due to current trends? There's definitely the possibility that, I'm trying to find the right way to say this. There's definitely the possibility that the Palestinian cities will effectively become city-states because of the presence of the settlements. I don't believe that the Palestinians would be eradicated in the sense of the population would be removed. The population is too well instantiated and they're too well protected from the perspective, because Israel needs Western support. As has been proved during the Gazan wars, Israel required weapons from the United States. So Israel can't divorce that connection. And as long as Israel can't divorce that connection, Israel can't eradicate the Palestinians as a question. Israel also, I don't believe, has the intention of eradicating Palestinians. So but even if it had the intention, it couldn't execute because of how deeply it needs the West. In terms of creating a governing apparatus, there's the current government continually flirts with the idea of annexation, but one of the red lines between Emirati and Israeli relations is annexation. And so I don't think that the Israelis want to cross the Emiratis, because in effect that ends up with them crossing the Saudis, and the Saudis are their biggest security partner in the region at this point. So I just don't see it from an Israeli realpolitik point of view, which is how a lot of Israelis tend to govern. They tend to govern realpolitik as opposed to in a more constructivist sense. And I think it's really one of those things where Israel can make more movement towards recognizing Palestine, but I think Palestine also needs to create viable democratic alternatives to Fatah and to Hamas in order to be able to govern themselves in a way that will satisfy Israel's security needs. I think that's it. Does anybody have any last questions, or? All right. So I'm going to close this out, and thank you everybody for coming. I'll see you next week.